Hello and welcome. The failure of capitalism is what some blame for the current global economic crisis. But is it as simple as that? And what are the alternatives? Europe has been hit especially hard by the recession, prompting many to wonder if free markets can coexist alongside the welfare state. The collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s ended not only the Cold War, but also dismantled the most visible representation of global socialism. Capitalism became the buzzword, with Russia and Eastern Europe spending a chaotic decade shifting to free market mentality. But some progressive European thinkers say the capitalist model is unsustainable, one that exacerbates divisions between the rich and poor. Governments are now slashing social programs to stay afloat, provoking a public outcry against cuts to what many consider an essential social safety net. So today we ask, if capitalism is indeed failing, what are the alternatives? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email to the show. Well, my guest today says we're approaching an apocalyptic doomsday that doesn't end with a global financial crisis. Slavoj Zizek has taken on many roles: philosopher, psychoanalyst, cultural theorist and professor. His latest book is titled Living in the End Times, and in it he argues that we are in denial about almost everything from looming environmental disasters to biogenetics and social divisions. Professor, great to have you on the show. Very honored.
I'm also honored. Thank you very much.
Well, sir, just to get a broad idea on what you wanted to touch on in this book, you talk about a number of key areas of apocalyptic crisis. So I want to touch on these, throughout the show. But you talk about environment, the economy, social imbalance, and biogenetics. So let me ask you, why pick these particular areas? Economic crisis, environment, social imbalance, and biogenetics.
I asked myself a very simple question. You remember 20 years ago when Francis Fukuyama presented his thesis on the end of history, people were making fun at him. Oh, that guy who thinks the history is over. But most of the people today, even most of the left, are Fukuyamaists. They really think that liberal democratic capitalism is our destiny. All we can do is make it a little bit more tolerant, a little bit more welfare state, and so on. And I asked myself a very simple question. Are there still, in today's global society, antagonisms, problems, which, the way I see it, I doubt that they can be resolved or even kept in check within this liberal democratic global capitalist frame? First, I see ecology, for obvious reasons. I know you can cope with ecology through market means at a local level by changing the taxing system, but not when you face great catastrophes. Then it's biogenetics. I think this is an unheard of domain of possible manipulations. Market cannot regulate it, not even state, I think. Then the new divisions, new forms of apartheid. There are already 1 billion people today on the earth living in slums. And finally, the inner logic of capitalism itself. Let's be frank. I think so-called intellectual property inherently doesn't function. There is something in it which resists being reduced to private property. And again, I'm not a cheap apocalyptic guy. I'm not saying 2012 or whenever there will be a catastrophe. Right. Let's be patient. No reason to lose nerves. Let's just be aware that we are dealing with a series of very serious problems which, if we just leave the existing society to develop following its inherent tendencies, right, will eventually lead to some kind of zero-level catastrophic point.
All right. Well, Professor, I'm going to go through some of the areas you touched on there. Let's start with economics and look at the economics of things. First of all, are we seeing basically the collapse of capitalism? And do you feel somewhat vindicated in your views by watching the global economy, crushing itself, and the foreclosures on properties, the bailouts and all this? Is this basically a vindicating situation for you?
No. Unfortunately, listen, I may still be a kind of a Marxist, but I'm very realist. I don't have these dreams, revolution is around the corner and so on. Absolutely not. I think it will, the present crisis will just make capitalism leaner and meaner in the long term. But there is another thing happening with today's capitalism which should worry every honest freedom lover much more than this. Countries like China and so on, all that we so poetically like to call capitalism with Asian values. What does this mean, their explosive growth? Till now, let's be clear, there was one good argument for capitalism. Sooner or later, after periods of dictatorship, 10, 20 years, capitalism always engendered a drive towards democracy. Now, I think it's no longer the case. I don't see any inherent tendency in countries like China or a softer version, Singapore, towards democracy, at least the way we understand it.
Professor?
In other words, we are approaching, sorry, just this, a situation where we have capitalism which is more efficient than Western liberal capitalism and which inherently no longer needs democracy.
What I wonder, Professor, from what you're saying is very interesting. Is it that, you know, the capitalism created an opportunity and perhaps gave people motivation and incentive, but I guess maybe greed took over?
Here I'm also a little bit more pessimist in the sense that I don't agree with what religious leaders always try to say, it's greed and so on. No, they are making it too personal. System asks this for you. That's the way the system functions. Listen, today we have a lot of critique of capitalism, almost a kind of overload of capitalism. You know, all the TV series, journalistic report, this company is corrupted, that company employs slave children, the third company is destroying environment. But they are all, for my taste, too legalistic, moralistic, as if there are greedy guys out there. No, capitalism functions inherently not as private egotism and greed, but almost as a kind of a religion. Profit matters, things must expand, things must develop, and even if we all go to hell, it has to reproduce itself. But so again, I agree with you, but don't personalize it.
Although the professor, you know, if we look at the social imbalance aspect of you know, your views, if we look at that element of what you talk about with the sort of apocalyptic crises, I wonder where the issue of morality comes in, because I know you see there's a failure of morality to some degree.
No, here again, unfortunately, I remain up to a point at least determined by the old Marxist view. Don't blame morality where much more systemic forces are at power. Morality is always here. The question is not, are people moral enough or not, but why can't they act in a moral way? In what social circumstances are people allowed to act upon their moral views and so on? And here I'm not just abstractly blaming capitalism. Look only at the suspicious role of not only theology, but also art, poetry. The strange result I arrived at studying ethnic cleansings, not only in my own ex-country, Bosnia, but Rwanda, elsewhere, is, to give you a brief formula which may shock you, no ethnic cleansing without poetry. You need to arouse people to do something as horrible as ethnic cleansing. You need some kind of ethnic national myth which gives to people the strength, the wrong, perverse strength to kill other people. For this, you need something spiritual.
I see what you're saying there, Professor. What about, where does tolerance fit into this? Because again, we're seeing in that social imbalance a lot of intolerance nowadays. There's religion comes into it, the issue of the hijab, the headscarf, all these things are now bubbling up into the surface. Where does tolerance fit in?
It's a nice point, you know. I think tolerance is one of those notions that I call notions of disorientation. Of course, it points towards a true problem. But at least the way we use this term in the West, it also mystifies things. For example, I made a simple test. When Martin Luther King, half a century ago, was fighting against racism, for the rights of the blacks, he practically never used the term tolerance. We use it today. Why? Because we live in what I call post-political society. The main problems we have are perceived as cultural problems and so on. So everything becomes a matter of tolerance. Point two, if you look closely at it, tolerance is a very suspicious notion. It means, yes, let's tolerate each other. But it also means, don't harass me, which means remain at a proper distance from me. If you scratch the surface, you will also discover that the other, that liberal multiculturalists are ready to tolerate, is what I ironically refer to as decaffeinated other. You know how we have today products deprived of their poisonous substance, decaf coffee, beer without alcohol, fat-free chocolate, and so on. And it seems to me that people also want decaffeinated other, this mythic, holistic, good other, and so on and so on. So tolerance is for me a very confused, disorienting term. I don't like it too much.
Well, Professor, we're coming up on a break.
I don't like tolerance. I want military spirit, struggle, but for the good cause.
I'll get onto that in just a second. But let me quickly, before we take a break, get a very quick answer to a question we had by email from Fahima Warsame, who wrote in. One of our viewers asked a simple question, and just give me a brief answer to this, and it's a tricky one though. Is a classless society possible?
Of course it is. Where is the problem? There were class societies, there will be. All I'm only saying is that a classless society does not automatically mean a society without even totalitarian terror, authority, and so on. That's the problem.
Okay, Professor, we're going to take a short break here. When we return, the challenge of climate change and growing ethnic hostilities around the world. More on that. Don't go away. Welcome back. What's the driving force behind anti-immigrant sentiments across Europe or a resistance to accepting climate change policies? It's fear, according to my guest. Slavoj Zizek, a philosopher and cultural critic, Dr. Zizek discusses the various stages of human reaction to world crises in his latest book. Now let's get back to some questions here. And Professor, I want to ask you about this issue of climate change and the fear factor that's generated around it. Let's get your perspective on where you think climate change really is and perhaps how we are mishandling the information.
Well, first I would like to describe in very simple terms a mechanism which in psychoanalysis is called disavowal, usually exemplified by the phrase, I know very well, but. Isn't it the way we really relate to the climate change is that we know rationally we are approaching a catastrophe, but we somehow in our guts cannot really accept it that it will happen. It's a very strange mechanism, and I think that at a more radical level even, you know, the problem with climate change, I think, is that, again, it cannot be resolved at the moral and legal level. Just, this is for me the problem with President Obama's, whom I appreciate very much, with President Obama's reaction to here in the States to the Louisiana coast oil spill. He treated it as simply another issue of locating, finding the culprit, punishing it, and so on and so on. For me, the problem is not BP, British Petroleum. It might have happened to another company, probably. The problem is a more global one, our way of life. How are we going to get ready for big changes ahead of us? Imagine, remember the Iceland volcanic ash, which interrupted travel around Europe. Imagine just 2-3 times stronger explosion, which may have rendered the whole Iceland, the whole state, uninhabitable. Where will people move? How will this be organized? And so on and so on. There are enormous challenges today, and it's ridiculous to think that we can solve them in this immediate, legal, moralistic way, find the culprits, and so on and so on. It's not a question of this, it's the question of changing the basic parameters of the system in the long term.
Professor, is it a problem with the media? Because the media likes a good story, so when you have issues such as climate change, it tends to become something of a commodity that the media handles.
True, but I wouldn't, it's all too easy to play this game to blame the media. I think if you really follow what honest journalists are doing, you can earn quite a lot. Let me give you a wonderful example of, you remember, it was half a year ago, or a little bit more, when the Taliban invaded, temporarily occupied the Swat Valley in Pakistan. Predominantly the media reported, another fundamentalist attack, and so on. But in some media, you found some missing details, that the whole Swat Valley was a kind of a neo-feudal domain, all land practically owned by 20-30 rich families. So this is how Taliban won there, not by some Islamic fundamentalism, but by telling to poor people, let's get rid of the rich landowners. So where were the liberals before? Seeing, why did no one notice this misery? Or let me give you another ultra example. We all know what is the humanitarian catastrophe today. Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. 2 years ago or 3, there was a cover story on the Time magazine demonstrating, everybody accepted this, that in the last 10 years in Congo, at least 5 million people died of unnatural causes. Congo is a nightmare, but it's not in. Nobody reports a lot about it and so on. I mean, even with all my sympathy for the suffering of the West Bank Palestinians, but if a child dies there, you still get at least a notice on the bottom page of New York Times or whatever. If thousands die in Congo, it's ignored. So again, it's a more complex mechanism. It's all too easy to just blame the media.
Now, one thing, of course, that is also something you touch on, it's an interesting one, is biogenetics and the risks and perhaps maybe the benefits that biogenetics might bring to humanity. Why again pick on that subject? You mentioned that it's a new area.
I think that we are confronting here something extremely interesting and dangerous. There is on the horizon, not in the sense of 200-300 years, we are talking about decades, a possibility of genetically manipulating not only physical but even psychological properties of larger and larger numbers of people. For example, a couple of months ago I visited China, where I was shown the program of some of their biogenetic institutions, where they openly state our goal is to ameliorate, to correct the physical and psychic characteristic of the Chinese people. So how to deal with this topic? Who will control it? You cannot trust the market, you cannot trust the state. On the other hand, it's clear to me that this Western, predominantly Christian, Catholic reaction, it's too dangerous, let's just prohibit it, let's avoid it, also doesn't help. We are here encountering a totally new situation where the traditional ethical prescripts simply don't function. You cannot simply apply to this old wisdom. Every one of us has to become, at some sense, a philosopher here, with open mind approaching this difficult problem.
Well, let's look, I mean, Europe in particular, and of course it's an area where you're very familiar with as well. It's one region that has really suffered, I guess, with the austerity measures and where the social system is very much under pressure because of the global economic conditions. And I wonder what your view is on how Europe might start to change shape politically over the coming years, how the pressures, the economic pressures and the need for a social safety net might contradict.
Let me give you, you know, there are wonderful American jokes that I like about doctors, you know, the jokes of what do we want to hear? First the bad news, then the good news. No? Right. So let me begin with bad news and then good news. Bad news is that I think that what we are witnessing now all around Europe is the beginning of an extremely dangerous tendency. The complete rearticulation of the basic coordinates of the political space. To be very short, till now we had two main parties, center-right, a center-left party, exchanging power in some regular electoral rhythm, whatever. Now it's more and more that one party is emerging as, let's call it, the party of the existing liberal capitalist democratic order. Usually it's pro-capitalist party, but at the same time socially relatively progressive, for gay rights, abortion, whatever you want. And then the only real opposition, the only opponent which really introduces passion are no longer leftists, but some kind of anti-immigrant populist nationalists. What is really worrying is that this is happening at the both extremes of the European space. Not only the latest development in the East European post-communist countries, Hungary, Romania, but even in the most developed and models of tolerance is European countries, like Scandinavian countries. So this is something to worry here, and I think my solution is a very simple one. There is something missing in this equation. Liberal center, populist, anti-immigrant, racist right. Only a new left can allow us to break out of this deadlock. Will it? I'm not sure. But you know what's the good news when you mention this? Listen, we are dealing here with a lot of ideology. One should never forget that neoliberalism is not economic practice. It's an ideology. The countries which proclaim to be pro-liberal are all the time breaking the rules. So let me report on a text that I read now, an excellent one, which takes Scandinavian countries and establishes that first, they are still far more egalitarian than anywhere else in the world. Like in Norway, the usual gap in a company between lowest and highest paid is 1 to 4. You still have health care, social security, and so on. But now comes the surprise. At the same time, these countries are on the top, immediately after Singapore and Hong Kong, of the competitiveness on the market. Here you have a clear empirical proof how more egalitarian spirit, social welfare, and so on, do not necessarily endanger competitivity.
So, Professor, with just literally 20 seconds to go, I want to get your perspective on the future. Is it ultimately light or dark? Do you see things getting better or getting worse?
Well, as a philosopher, I will give you an apparently contradictory answer. There is light, but the only way to light is through courageously confronting darkness.
Professor, I hope we get a chance to chat some more. It was an excellent chance to have a chat with you. Thank you so much.
I'm grateful to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And thank you for being with us. Remember, you can follow our program on Twitter. We'll keep you notified on upcoming shows, and you can send us questions and comments to pose to our guests. On the next show, bucking the trend. As Islamophobia rises in Europe and the US, the Canadian city of Calgary has elected the country's first Muslim mayor. Nahid Venshi helps us to examine Canada's multicultural mosaic. Be sure to tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.